What is up, y'all? My name is Kristen.
My name is Sarah.
And welcome to the Red Rum and Red Wine podcast. The time has come, y'all. Hi if you're new. We may have a few new followers here from TikTok, so thank you for tuning in and listening. We definitely appreciate it. Did not expect the reaction that last TikTok got, but definitely welcomed. But for those who are new, I have been dropping hints over the past month or two, because that's how long it's taken me to read this. But I have finally finished a book that I have been reading, and I can finally give you all the title. I just got done reading Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington, and when I tell you this was one of the most knowledgeable yet horrific reads that I have ever read. Get something strong if you do not have it already, or at least something with a shit ton of sugar if you don't drink, because it is this book goes into 3 parts. The first part, which is the part that I'm going to be talking about today, goes into the role that African Americans played in America's discovery of medicine from the beginning of the New World up until the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1932. Part 2 of the book goes into the experimentations that were going on through the early 20th century to present day, and then the third part dives into the contemporary research issues that still affect the Black community in the medical field to this day. Basically, this book, if you couldn't guess, it just goes into the experimentation that was done on the Black community throughout.
Wow.
The foundation of America. It is, you learn a lot of things that were not taught in school. I don't mean to laugh. It is just so shocking, but I highly, highly recommend reading this book. I am barely scratching the surface on each of the parts. Harriet gives so much factual evidence into the events that happened, as well as gives way more detail into experiments that I don't even talk about in the episodes. So it's a very good but hard read, and I very much recommend it if anyone is interested in this subject or is interested in what I'm talking about. But let's get into it. It is very bleak. As many of us know, racism has been an ongoing event. Apparently, as early as AD 160, Roman physicians such as Galen would describe African Americans in their writings as possessing oversized sexual organs and having inferior intelligence to them. It kind of makes sense because Romans did equate small penises with high intelligence. So, or maybe that wasn't them, but I think
You mean big penises with.
No, it was a literal thing. If you had a small wee wee, they thought you were intelligent. That's why all of the marble statues have small dicks on them.
Huh.
Yeah, because they thought it's a terrible time for people with a sex drive, but that was societal standards. They wanted you to have a small dick. Maybe because it was a problem back then and they just needed to feel better about themselves. Who knows? But yeah.
Who knows?
So this mindset easily travels throughout time and into the slave trade, during which the 16 to 1700s African Americans were straight up kidnapped from their homeland and brought to the New World in order to work for the white people. To many of the whites that lived in the New World, African Americans were by no means people to them, and so they were not treated as such. Even on the ships going from Africa into the New World, medical experimentations were performed on people. There was apparently something with their lymph nodes, if a sleeper's sickness, and so they would perform surgeries on these inflamed lymph nodes without any anesthesia, and you're in a really dirty setting, and if they didn't survive, they would just simply be tossed off the ship.
Oh.
If you did survive the trail into the New World, You were not free of the medical experimentation that was to come with the discovery of Western medicine. One of the actual remedies that doctors would give for sick slaves at the time was 9 drops, meaning slashes, like whipping slashes, of essence of rawhide. And this was said to be given to a sick slave in order to get them not sick anymore and make them work.
Yeah. The math isn't adding up there.
Math is not mathing. And if they were called because someone was too sick to work or to do anything, by the time a doctor was actually called to give any type of medical aid, if any was given, it would usually be too late for the slave. Like, they called 5 days too late. Or, like, sometimes there was one instance where the enslaved woman had been sick for months. And when she died, the master was just like, oh, well, I guess she just, like, faked it really good and she just died. I don't know. It's like, I don't understand half the things I read in this book. It's not logical. It's very hard and confusing and upsetting to read.
I have a feeling I'm going to be, like, cringing this whole time. So
the entire time. There were credible remedies, medicinal plants that have been used by the indigenous people of the New World, as well as the medicinal remedies that the African American tradition, the people brought from their tradition, in which they used spiritual as well as plant knowledge passed down from generations and generations of apprenticeships from these herb doctors in their communities, which have been known to cure their people for quite some time and help in things like birth and sickness. To these American physicians, this was all hoo-ha, and it was not credible, and they often called them stupid for using it. They really said, fuck them plants and your knowledge, and we're gonna use chemicals instead. And do you want to know what those chemicals were? Because they're so fucking smart. Mercury and arsenic, not even joking, were said to be a very common medicine used throughout that time, which, as you know, can kill you when taken in a certain amount of doses. But in order to perfect these remedies that these physicians are working on, they do not want to use themselves or the white people in their community, because what if something goes wrong? That would be just terrible. So what they do is take the people who have no legal rights and weren't even seen as people and use them for whatever experiments they wanted. And that was the enslaved as well as free African Americans that lived in the New World. You'll see sometimes being free wasn't enough. You would still get thrown into these experiments because you're either too poor or you have literally no legal rights at this time, even if you were free. And some doctors would say, like, freedom itself was a disease, and if you were a freed Black person, you would go insane because you couldn't handle the thought of being free. It would drive you insane. That was a literal thought that they had back in the day.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. You would catch a glimpse of what these enslaved people went through when a former slave known as Fed escaped from the New World and entered England in 1847. John Fed Brown was a dark-skinned man in his 40s who had gone to England and met British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society Secretary L.A. Chenerozvos. Sorry, that's going to be wrong. In 1855, and with John write John's memoir, which would later be titled Slave Life in Georgia. The most chilling tales that John would speak of came from his time with Dr. Thomas Hamilton of Clinton, Georgia, and John stayed with Dr. Hamilton from the 1820s till about the early 1830s. Hamilton was seen as a widely respected physician who had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and later from there became a wealthy plantation owner. He also became a physician, he was a politician, and he also was a trustee of the Medical Academy of Georgia. So a very highly credited, highly respected white man of the town. John Brown would meet Dr. Hamilton after John's master, a man named Steve, had gotten sick. John would recall in his memoir, which Harriet would put in the book, "I don't know what his malady was. It must have been serious, for they called in to treat him one Dr. Hamilton, who lived in Jones County, and who had a great name. He cured Stevens, who was so pleased that he told the doctor to ask him any favor, and it should be granted." Now it so happened that this Dr. Hamilton had been trying a great number of experiments for the purpose of finding out the best remedies for sunstroke. John would say, "I was, it seems, a strong and likely subject to be experimented upon, and the doctor, having fixed the thing in his mind, asked Stevens to lend me to him. This he did at once, never caring to inquire what was going to be done with me."
God.
From here, Hamilton would go on to create this makeshift sauna. It was basically described that he dug a pit into the ground in this enclosed room and then made a fire in the pit. From here, he would have Brown sit naked on a stool right next to the pit and cover Brown all in wet blankets in order to retain the heat, and have him sit in this room and have it get really hot. Hamilton would wait until it got around 100 degrees, and from there he would start to administer remedies into John Brown until he fainted from the heat. Once John fainted, the doctor would have men drag him out to revive him and then note what degree of heat it was that he passed out at. Brown would be sent back to work in the field after these. So basically his day was, he would wake up, he would go work out in the field, he would get done, be given some nostrum, and then have the experiment be given to him. And then once he fainted and was revived, he would be put to bed and then have to wake up and do it all over again. Until Hamilton found some kind of cure for this sunstroke, heat stroke. I do not know how long it took for Dr. Hamilton to create this remedy, but he eventually did. Brown would state in his memoir that he, meaning Dr. Hamilton, had found that a cayenne pepper tea accomplished his object to cure the sunstroke. And he made a very nice thing of it, apparently. John would state that as soon as he got back home, he advertised that he had discovered a remedy for sunstroke. It consisted of pills which were to be dissolved in cayenne pepper tea, without which, he said, the pills would not produce any effect. Nor did I see how they should have done so, for they were only made of common flour.
What?
However, he succeeded in getting them into general use, and he asked a good price. He soon realized a large fortune. So not only is this fucking doctor experimenting on enslaved people without, screw consent, he's just straight up torturing him because he can. He is then finding a remedy and, selling placebo pills, stating, oh, you have to put the flour in this cayenne pepper tea and then this pill will work, knowing that the cayenne pepper tea is the actual fucking remedy. So it's and it's just the flour, why? Why couldn't you do something dissolvable? It's imagine,
you can even do sugar pills.
Imagine the consistency of that. Mush. Oh.
Soup.
One would assume that these experiments on John Brown would be done once a remedy was made, but it wasn't. It was the last, not even the scratch of the surface of what was to be of Brown's torture. And it was said that he was given just a few days rest, and then another experiment would begin. This time, Dr. Hamilton wanted to ascertain how deep John's black skin went. He would try to figure this out by applying blisters to Brown's hands, legs, and feet in an undescribed method. We don't know how, but I don't even want to imagine. John would state that he used to blister me at intervals of about 2 weeks. He also tried other experiments upon me, which I cannot dwell upon. Brown would experience, unknown amount of pain and suffering before he finally had enough and decided death, trying to escape and dying, is better than me staying here. And by the grace of God, like, he was able to escape without injury and flee to England, though who knows the injuries that he permanently has from those experiments that were being done upon him. Medical experimentation during this time was a very lucrative business, solely for the whites, of course. And they often benefited from the medical processes that had to be perfected and needed people in order to do that. It was also an easy way for physicians to gain notoriety and fame, which many of them craved, at the expense of the communities that they so viciously tortured. Though blacks only made up to 40% of the South's population, you would see them overrepresented in every medical experimentation that was done. 30 out of the 37 experimental cesarean sections done by Dr. Francois Marie Prevost was made up of slaves. And I don't think that anesthesia was used during this time.
Do you know when it was?
No, I didn't write down the year, and I don't think that maybe she did.
Anesthesia, or like a form of it, was
1830s.
Yeah, I think it was around, I don't know, I'm trying to recall the knowledge I have collected from watching Call the Midwife, because it's in like the olden days. And you kind of see the breakout of new medical technology throughout the show.
The one unfortunate fact, I didn't write it down, but it very much shocked me to my core and engraved in me when I read it, was that we figured out that chloroform was a good way of anesthesia when a black slave, I believe he was 19, came in with abdominal pain, and the doctor went in, chloroformed him, and then helped with the abdominal pain, but also took out a testicle. And the slave didn't find out until years later. He was like one of the last ones on the plantation to find out, because the doctor then went on and bragged about, oh, I took this guy's testicle out and he didn't even know. This is like a great form of anesthesia. And so that's how that was discovered.
Oh,
yeah.
fuck.
Yeah. Like, facts like this are littered throughout the book, and it, like, I don't even say half of them. It's, read the book. It is very eye-opening. Dr. James Douglas' experimental subjects for his pioneered eye surgery were made up of 80% blacks. 4 out of his 5 subjects were slaves. In 1982, an article would detail the antebellum experiments, which is what this chapter was named after, would say that some of the whites took advantage of the Southern blacks by testing new techniques or remedies in the name of medical progress. In several instances, there are physicians who will solely purchase blacks for the purpose of experimentation. And you would see other doctors use free blacks and slaves owned by others in their experiments. So no one is safe, free or slaved. If you're black in America during this time, you have a high chance of being thrown into a medical experiment that you don't have any consent of. Some people didn't even know that they were being experimented on, which, like, we get into later. But even our third president, Sir Thomas Jefferson himself, was in on the experimentation game.
Okay, why am I not surprised? Because he loved his little slaves.
He had, like, children with very many of them, if I fucking recall. And it's sad because they're probably some of the people that he fucking experimented on. It's just like, what the fuck? So Thomas Jefferson wanted to validate a new vaccination technique that was made by Edward Jenner. So in 1796, Thomas Jefferson would obtain a cowpox vaccine by Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse of Boston and spend that entire summer vaccinating what he would tell the media, the public during that time, were 200 members of his family and some neighborhood slaves. And he used this wording because he is a smooth-talking president. And he does not want any criticism coming back from him because he just gave a really big sympathetic speech about how he feels so sorry for the Black community and he wants to help these enslaved folks. But what he did not mention to the public was that 200 members of his family were not his white family, but the slaves that him and his son owned.
And this vaccine was experimental?
Experimental.
Okay.
It was shown in early trials to not work.
Okay.
And he would wait until this vaccine was, I guess it did work at some point. And when it did show that it wasn't straight up just killing the slaves, he would then go on to give it to his white family, but only then. And Jefferson was not the first or the last person to hide the fact that he was experimenting on Black people. And you see this in the next doctor that I talk about. And his name is James Marion Sim. Now, if you have a vagina...
Oh, no.
Trigger warning. This...
Oh, I'm already, like, my body... I have goosebumps. What are you going to say? My legs are, like, crossed as tight as they can be.
It's not... James Marion Sims was born into a struggling family of 10. Now, he is from Hanging Rock, South Carolina, and was born in 1813. I don't know what day. It doesn't really matter. And though he was described as somewhat of a mediocre student throughout his career, he gained notoriety for being one of the most selfless doctors towards women to ever exist.
Oh, God.
Like I have kind of mentioned before, this time is long, like, doctors didn't wash their hands back then. We didn't know about bacteria back then. We didn't know...
Sterilization.
Yeah, none of that was a conception in these people's... or a concept in these people's minds. But Sims would start to notice that there was a high death rate among enslaved mothers and their children. And as soon as Sims sees this, instead of thinking, oh, it's probably because we're forcing them to give birth into these dirty shacks, Sims goes, no, it's because these mothers are lazy and weak. Now, Sims did not just work on enslaved women. In fact, before he got his big break, he began his medical journey detailing how he received 17 new slaves with whom he planned to do experiments on. Now, out of the 17, 3 were said to have fared miserably under Sims' faltering scalpel. That is all that I was able to get. While we are told that another 19-year-old enslaved man would die after 2 gruesome operations in which the removal of bone segments was done without the use of anesthesia. You will see, and that's why I'm like, I don't really think the years matter, because even when anesthesia is made, and we'll find out in the later stories, like, they don't care. The doctors will not use it on these enslaved people because they don't want to waste the resources, and they will flat out say, like, oh, blacks feel pain differently than whites. They don't, like, I get into it. It's bad. Sims would also show how truly mediocre of a student he was when he forgot to remove a sponge from a patient's mouth after performing surgery that was meant to remove part of the patient's cancerous jaw. The patient nearly suffocated and died because of this. But it would be on some random day in June in 1845 with an 17-year-old enslaved woman named Anarcha that Sims would finally catch his big break and become known for the doctor that he is known to this day. On a Westcott plantation just outside of Montgomery, Alabama, 17-year-old Anarcha was about to give birth. She had been in labor for 3 days before Sims was called in to use obstetrical forceps.
Oh.
Though it was said in the book that he had little experience with these.
Okay.
For reasons unknown, the baby would end up dying during birth. though the worst was far from over for Anarcha. She had received a tear when Sims went in to use the forceps. And because this is done in a dirty shack where these tools are not sterilized in between use, she got an infection. This is where the trigger warning starts. Her vagina began to erode. It was described in the book.
My hair is literally standing up. Oh my god.
I'm
sorry, I just have like the nastiest visual of disintegrating.
I don't even know how it was described that she would be left not only with random holes around the area that were not holes that should be there. It left basically one giant opening from her vagina, her bladder, and then her rectum. Because of this, no control of your bladder is happening.
I'm clenched.
She would have you would be peeing on yourself basically because you have no control over this, and this is causing triggering pain, so much pain because this is all gaping opening wounds, and it's causing a reoccurring infection. It has no chance to clean itself, and she's on top of this living in a dirty shack. Anarcha was not the only woman to suffer from this. I did not get a percentage on this, but this was from what I was described or what I read as a somewhat common thing to happen. From any woman, all skin colors would suffer from this, but enslaved women in particular had much higher percentages of receiving this infection than white women, though they would still get it from time to time. But Sims himself would note that it was, and this infection that I'm talking about is known as vesicovaginal fistula. But he would notice that this fistula was going on when forceps were used during birth, which probably makes sense because they're not sterilizing it, so you're getting everyone's bacteria from birth
they're
to
setting
birth.
it down on whatever surface.
Yeah, they do not care. They're wearing their street clothes. It's people today more so think that it had something to do a little bit with the vitamin D deficiency, though I don't really think that's the cause. They say sometimes it can cause a small pelvis. What I really think it was the fact that these enslaved women were forced to become mothers a whole 3 years earlier than a white woman was during this time.
Not fully formed, yeah.
They are probably literal children giving birth, and so their pelvises are underdeveloped. They're not ready for the labor of childbirth. In one of her memoirs, to put into perspective the things that this woman had to do, a former slave, Harriet Jacobs, would say that she had been forced with so many sexual demands that she had just stopped fighting it because, in her words, it was less humiliating to give in than to be forced to do it. This is what these women had to deal with on the daily. In order to find a solution to the vesicovaginal fistula problem that was going on, Sims decided that he needed 11 slave women who all had this infection to experiment on them. So he would promise their masters lodging, board, and treatment of these women if the masters would essentially give them up. For free, I don't think that Sims was going to give them any money, but he was just basically saying, I'll take care of them and I'll cure them.
I'll take them off your hands.
Yeah. The masters were more than happy with this. The white people were more than happy with this because this infection made it so that these women literally couldn't stand up and work. So they were MIA from the field, and it was more so of a burden on the master to have them and feed them than to just give them up and obviously they don't care what happens to them. So as soon as Sims received his 11 enslaved women, he would take them to a wooden building which he had built himself and proceeded to conduct surgical experiments on these 11 women for the next 4 years. This is a time period where gynecology is not a thing. Like, the word is far from being founded or, like, made up. And so the common practice back in the day during this time was that women doctors would go into the room. They'd have you sit in a chair. The doctor would avert their gaze, stick their hand up your skirt, and then touch your lady bits. And, like, use their hands as their eyes in order to feel what's going wrong. Apparently. Sims didn't do this method, though it's not a good thing at all. Sims takes it to a whole nother level. He would force these women to completely undress head to toe. And then he would force them to kneel on their hands and knees, while not just him, but several physicians would come and take turns inserting this speculum that Sims himself had devised from other experiments that he had done previously on these enslaved women, and opened up their vaginas for full display.
Ugh.
He would write in a medical journal, "I saw everything as no man had seen before." And then he gets the whole fucking town of Montgomery to go in and stare at this woman's vagina. It said that, like, prominent citizens would be invited to come in, physicians from other parts of the town, from other places, like, everyone, if they wanted to, and you were white and rich, could go in and view what was going on.
Oh, fuck.
The women were not given anesthesia during these surgeries that Sims performed, and they were extremely painful. The only drug that was used was a morphine that Sims gave them after the operation in order to keep the women more controllable and addicted. What Sims would do during these procedures, and this is again, major trigger warning, is to try and close the unnatural openings that were occurring on the vagina during this infection. Now, the vaginal tissue that was open, it was said that it didn't have an edge. So, like, the skin didn't have an edge in which he could suture the edges together. So in order to make his own edge, it was said that Sims would scar the edge in order to get those two scarred bits and knit them together.
So scar, like, he had to have like burned them, maybe?
It doesn't say in the book. I'm kind of glad, but I would assume it's like some type of like cauterization that's going on. Oh, that did not help.
Sorry.
Because so Sims was said to like be a pretty clean doctor as far as doctors go. Like, he just naturally cared, I guess, about his environment, but it, like, even with him being clean, it obviously wasn't clean enough. These stitches, these sutures would get very infected and then just painfully reopen again.
Ugh.
And so Sims would then go back in and redo this. So since he's not using anesthesia, there are several male doctors that were brought in to help Sims, and their job was to hold these women down while Sims went in and made these sutures. The experiments went on for 4 years. It took just 1 year for all of these male physicians to leave because they could no longer bear these women's screams. And after this, the women themselves were forced to hold one another down while Sims experimented on them. Now, there would be medical journals at the time that these experiments were going on stating that if you inhaled ether, it would knock you out and it would work as an anesthesia. Sims claimed that these were not painful enough procedures to justify the trouble and risk of attending the administration of these pain medicines that would help these poor women who are screaming to the point where male doctors left their fucking job.
But it doesn't hurt enough.
And Sims even goes against his own word. So he proves to himself that it is fucking painful, because he writes about a time where he has a slave whose name is Lucy, and says that she was so much prostrated that I thought she was going to die. And he would further write in 1852 and say that that was before the days of anesthetics, and the poor girl on her knees bore the operation with great heroism and bravery. But he would continue to do these.
Because she had any choice.
Yes,
right?
she was forced to do it. She literally, what was she going to do? And obviously Sims knew this, because when the procedure is, the same procedure is done on the white women of Montgomery, you bet your bottom dollar that ether was used. Though, not so fun fact, this same ether method would also be used on white women suffering from vaginismus. Come at me. I know I say everything wrong. But this is basically a disorder where vaginal muscle contractions prevent the penetration of anything. So like, okay. The women that have to use dilators to help with their vaginal openings typically tend to suffer from this. Their vaginal walls just contract so much that you can't even stick a finger in there sometimes. Yeah, and it's extremely painful for women suffering from this. Husbands who couldn't bear their wives' protests of like, don't have sex with me because it's so painful for me, would take them to Dr. Sims, who would proceed to use ether on them to knock them out, and then let their husbands go in the room and have sex with their unconscious bodies. So it would take four years of these tortured procedures back to the enslaved women that was going on, when in May of 1849, after more than 30 operations on Anarcha alone, so she is 21, I believe, around 21 at this time.
Oh my God.
Sims finally finds his surgical solution, which it actually did work. So silver sutures, which are known to not harbor any pathogens, and it's actually what we still use today. When I fucked up my shin, they gave me silver to put in my leg to help regrow the skin. So like, mm-hmm. But the way you found out about it, no. Because of this, he was deemed the father of American gynecology. And then he went on to open the first hospital for women in New York City. So everyone looked at him and they thought, wow, what an amazing guy. He would get into French royal circles. He became rich and famous off of this. Many hospitals and clinics popped up with his name, many of which still bear his name to this day.
No.
Yep. Boycott immediately. What the fuck? Name it after fucking Anarcha. Name it. There's actually a portrait that is done by Robert Toms J. I don't know if that's his full name. I don't really fucking care. It's titled The Marion Sims Gynecologic Surgeon, and it is an oil representation of the experimental surgery that was done upon his powerless slave, who was named Betsy. The painting is a travesty to Betsy, Anarcha, and all of the other nameless women that this motherfucker experimented on. In his painting, like, these women are fully clothed. They are, like, he's being very modest with them. It's just painting a fucking lie. It is a lie. It hides the true horrors that happen to these women. And round of applause to Harriet. Harriet would try to have the painting redone for its true horror, like the true representation of what happened to these women, so she could slap it on the cover of her book. But Pfizer, we know them from COVID, felt uncomfortable with what they were reading and refused to grant Harriet permission to do this. Of course, because why would we want to tell the truth? Why would we want to?
I don't know. I think I'm going to order a print of that painting and fix it myself.
Yeah. Because what the fuck? And I need to know all of the names, all of the hospitals named after this dude, because we need to get it changed. It needs to be the names of these women. Father of gynecology, my ass. These are
because he didn't father shit besides.
No, these are the women of gynecology, because without them, like, oh my God, and their name is tarnished. So it's just, so many nameless people throughout this never are properly acknowledged for their role in the medical foundings, and they were forced into it. They didn't even have a choice, and we're going to just tarnish their names like that. It's just very upsetting overall, but I just wish there was something more I could do right now. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not known whether because it's not enough for Sims to find a remedy for this. Once Sims finds the remedy, he doesn't go back and close the other fistulas that are going on with these other women that are suffering because of him. And it's just, it would be revealed by a colleague, though. I did find his colleague insisted that not one half of the slave women that they worked upon together were afforded relief by the years of painful surgeries that were done to them. And Bozeman himself would go in and try to fix the fistulas using a button suture, which he perfected, again, experimenting on his slave women, 3 women named Kitty, Dinah, and one who is unnamed and is just described as a mulatto girl. And again, it's just a common reoccurrence and an unfortunate part of our reality that a lot of these people who were sacrificed in the name of medicine are not going to be properly acknowledged because they were just lost in translate. Ugh. And if disrespecting the living isn't enough, we disrespect them when they are dead. Many of us true crime fans are somewhat aware with the stealing of corpses that went on during the foundation of medicine. It was a huge practice for medical students when cadavers ran low for them to go in and basically steal bodies from graves. But what a lot of us fail to realize is how much this affected the Black communities during this time. African Americans were once at the highest risk of being used for anatomy, and for many areas, the majority of the cadavers that were done in name of research or dissection were Black. It's said that this is no longer the case, though there's no good ethnic national data to back this up. And there is a Uniform Anatomical Gift Act of 1968, which provides the distribution of unclaimed bodies to go to medical schools. And unfortunately, a lot of the unclaimed bodies tend to be of minority groups that are poor and homeless. So evidence is kind of pointing towards maybe it's not the case that that's no longer the case. It's probably still happening. Even if these bodies are claimed and put to rest, that's not good enough, because Blacks are still more at risk for having their bodies stolen straight from the grave. And this is what we see in the case of Addie Mae Collins. Addie Mae was a 13-year-old girl who had actually been one of the 4 girls that were killed in the 1963 bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. Her family was so grief-struck by this event that it would take them 30 years before her sisters, Janie Gaines and Sarah Cox, could bear the thought of even visiting their sister's grave.
Oh, wow.
And when they arrived, they were heartbroken at what they saw. The headstone was crumbling off, there was trash littered everywhere, tangled weeds were all over the place, and they just really couldn't bear the thought of having their sister be buried somewhere where it just looks so unorganized and trashed. And they immediately arranged to have Addie Mae move to another much better maintained cemetery so they could visit her and she could have a nice place to rest. But when the workers came to open the grave to remove Addie Mae, they were shocked to find that there was no body in the casket. Addie Mae's body, like so many buried in Black cemeteries during the time throughout the South, had gone missing.
Oh, fuck.
And it was more times than not that the families would not be able to find their loved ones after this happened. And I believe that this was the case with Addie Mae just because it took 30 years for them to go to the cemetery to figure out that her body wasn't there.
Fuck.
One thing that we also see in the case of Casper Yagen is that they are not even taken from the grave, they are taken right from their literal deathbed. Casper Yagen was a 68-year-old retired auto mechanic who vanished on September 11th of 1977. His sister, Pearlie Smith, who had lived with him, had called the police in Washington, D.C., and provided a photo and description of her brother and said, "Hey, I haven't seen him. He's gone missing. Can you please help me?" For over a month, Pearlie, Casper's niece, Minnie Champ, and other family members had to make relentless inquiries to the police at the 5th District Station about their brother because, of course, the police really didn't do much of anything after the report was made. The family would call hospital emergency departments. They would go see them in person, but everyone that they had spoken to assured them that Casper had not been brought to the hospital and that he had probably just went on some crazy little bender, some crazy little journey. He'll come back later. It doesn't matter. Like, don't worry about it. It's fine. Then we have a police officer asked the hospital the same question that the family had been asking on November 1st, 1977. Only this time, the hospital gives them a different answer. The officer not only gets in contact with the first officer with whom Pearlie had spoken to and made the initial report, but he discovers that the first officer's original report had not been filed properly. There were a margin of errors within this report, as well as the fact that the officer never personally checked the emergency rooms, and the missing person unit assigned to this case never followed the proper procedure of checking Casper's description against a list of recently deceased unidentified patients within that hospital. When they finally did this, that is when they found Casper's body. It was on a slab in the anatomy laboratory of Howard University Medical School and was on the verge of being dissected by students. While his family had been constantly searching and worrying about him, doing more work than the actual police had, he had laid unconscious in the hospital by himself. It turns out that on September 11th, he had supposedly been taken in by police for being inebriated, and the police from there went to take him to the detoxification center. A paper that would have easily been found in his wallet that contained his nephew's name and address had been ignored and tossed aside with all of the other possessions that Casper had and left in a storage unit in the detoxification center. The next day when Casper became ill, they would take him to Howard University Hospital, but they would not bring any of the possessions that he had with him. So that little piece of paper with his family's information, a 5-second search was all it would have taken to identify this man, and they didn't do that. Instead, they just took him to Howard University Hospital and labeled him a John Doe. Over the next months, because it took until around November to find him, hospital staffers would repeatedly tell Casper's sister to her face that no one of his description had been admitted, even though all of them knew that there was an unidentified patient in that hospital during the time that matched the fucking description. It was said that Casper would die alone in the hospital on November 3rd, and what was described by Dr. Linwood Rayford, who was the school's assistant medical director at the time, would tell the Washington Post that his remains, through some lottery, were decided to be awarded to medical schools. And it just so happened that Howard was the school that it wound up being through that random lottery.
So he was in the hospital for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess he was never aware or well enough to
I don't know
his name.
I don't know if he was conscious during that time.
Yeah.
But I also... Yeah, it doesn't give that much detail, and I'm not shocked that it doesn't, because no paper would honestly want to talk about this. Mm-hmm. But from what it seemed, he was unconscious while he was at the hospital. I don't know if that's because of whatever illness. I don't even think I learned what in the book what illness he dies from. It's just he ends up dying. They have information that could inform them on who this is, but they pretty much ignore it. And then through a lottery, kind of, again, like that act that I was talking about, where if it's an unidentified body, because the act is it's in act while this is going on. Like, it's a acting thing. I don't know what the fuck I'm trying to say, but it's like a thing that's going on. So if he was an unidentified body, then it was within law of the hospital to go ahead and through a lottery, like, give him to whatever school. But it's funny how it just ended up being the school for the hospital that he was at. A weird coinky dink, if you will. Police would use fingerprints on January 4th of 1978 to confirm without a doubt that this was in fact Casper Yagan. And then from here, the family would have to fight yet another battle with the legal system in order to try and get justice for what happened to their family member. The family would attempt to sue the city of DC and Howard University for negligence. Judge Nicholas Nunzio would attempt to dismiss these negligence charges altogether against the hospital, but thankfully a jury on the District of Columbia Superior Court decided against the city's initial decision.
Okay, that's good.
The family would initially be awarded $53,000 during the time. I don't know how much that is in today's money, but it doesn't really matter because the ruling against the city and the award was reversed on an appeal.
Oh my God.
So the city was not held liable for any negligence, or the hospital, and the money that was initially rewarded to the family was taken away. Probably because like people knew that this had been going on, because something that fucking shook me to my core was on a hot day in Augusta, Georgia in August, construction workers would find a rather shocking scene. They had been working on a 154-year-old Greek revival structure that once housed the Medical College of Georgia when they, I guess, broke down a wall and found in a basement nearly 10,000 human bones and skulls, many of which bore the mark of 19th century anatomy tools or were numbered with a type of India ink. It would be said that they would find like fetal organs in vats of whiskey and like broken vats with bones and like liquid pouring out. Just there was a detailed analysis that was done on these bones and the surrounding materials that was found in this basement, and of this it was revealed that 75% of these bones belonged to that of the African American community. Although, at the time, blacks only constituted about 42% of the area's population. But if it makes you feel better, the doctors they're a little affected. Just barely. You hear in a memoir that Dr. Prey in November of 1846 would recall how during his very first anatomical dissection, he felt an overwhelming amount of sympathy for the young girl that he was about to dissect. He would tell the room, "Today our subject, a poor N-word girl, was brought up. Poor, despised, and disregarded African. Degraded and despised in life, you are to be made a spectacle and subject of ridicule, an obscene jest, even in death." He would then go into a detailed public dissection of the girl's labia after he made that statement.
Oh my.
And then they get over it really fucking easily. Just a year later, this same doctor wrote that during one night, he made a group of white women from his own social class scream in delight. Why, you ask? Because he was frightening them with what he described as a piece of dead N-word that he saved from his dissection table and then took out and started chasing the women around with. That is what he thought of these bodies after just a year of dissecting them. And it is not just hospitals that so blatantly and obviously disrespect these people, my mind was blown when I found out that in 1903, the St. Louis Exposition Company set Samuel Phillips Werner, who was a missionary explorer, out on an exposition not to hunt animals, but to hunt men. It would be described that, or he would be asked to bring African pygmies, which are people in Africa and Southeast Asia that are known for their short statures. And he was basically sent there to capture them and then bring them so that they could be displayed on the St. Louis World's Fair. Werner didn't seem to have a problem with the thought of taking someone from Africa back to America, considering that he had fathered a son and daughter with an African orphan girl. I don't know if it was consensually, honestly, probably not. But he has a son and a daughter from an African girl that he had during his expeditions from 1895 to 1899. So you would think that he would have some sort of like humanity towards these type of people, but I also have a deadbeat dad, so like I get it. Okay, it's fine. In 1903, Werner would go out on this expedition, and from here he would capture 23-year-old Otabenga, who was a Mbuti widower from South Africa in what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, Ota had originally been captured by the Force Publique, which is a group of thugs that was supported by the Belgian government. I hope I'm saying that right. And he was captured after he returned to his village to find it completely in ruins, his wife, his children, and all of the other villagers brutally slain.
Oh, wow. So he was like fresh widow.
Freshly... Yes. And like villageless. He was seized by this Force Publique group, and then from here he was sold to Werner. Werner would then meet with the director of the Bronx Zoological Gardens, William T. Hornday, who we actually have to thank for modern day American zoos, though like don't thank him because he's not a good guy. So zoos back in the day only used to have taxidermized animal. They only used to have animals that were stuffed, so like taxidermied animals. Yeah.
Oh.
But William had an idea. He thought, hey, wouldn't it be so cool if we added a wing of living animals to the current zoo so we could show off our new possessions? So they were like, yeah, cool, no problem. So they got a cage that housed an orangutan named Dohong, and they got another cage that housed a gorilla named Dinah. They got another cage right in the middle and placed Otabenga in it. And this enclosure would read, "The African Pygmy, Otabenga. Height 4 feet 11 inches. Weight 103 pounds. Brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State, South Central Africa by Dr. Samuel P. Werner. Exhibited each afternoon during September."
Oh my God.
His cage would be littered with bones, and zoo officials would give him a bow and arrow as decor to set the ambiance. And people ate it up. They flocked to see Ota. Over 40,000 visitors, it was said, would go to the park on one Sunday day alone. Over 40,000 people would come in, and every one of them would make their way to the monkey house so they could see Otabenga. People would go as far as chasing him around the grounds. Like, I don't know how they were able to do this, if they let him out or what. It would be said that they would poke his ribs. They would even go as far as tripping him. All the while, they are laughing at him, yelling at him, screaming obscenities, and just being racist fucks. It was only when Ota snapped and he finally retaliated and attacked back that he was let go from the zoo. He was never paid for this, mind you. They took him from his home, which they demolished, killed his wife and children, took him from his village, which they destroyed, brought him to a new world, didn't pay him, put him in a zoo, and then when he finally stood up for himself, they said, fuck you, and left him out to rot. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, there were some Black New Yorkers in the area that they really did try. They organized a collection in an attempt to raise money to get Ota back to South Africa, where he so desperately wanted to go. He wanted to go home, even though like he didn't have a home to go to. He wanted to go to his homeland, you know. But unfortunately, they were unable to collect enough money, so he didn't have enough to go back. It was only enough to get his teeth filled, and then they used the rest to send him to the Virginia Theological Seminary and College, where he was able to prove himself like quite a good student. And from here, he was able to find work in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a tobacco factory. And it said that he did fit in quite well. He was a very efficient worker. He loved to teach the local children how to fish and hunt. But it was really once he understood that it was a for sure fact he would never make enough money, and there would never be an opportunity for him to see enough money to make his way back to Africa, that he became super depressed and would ultimately commit suicide in 1916. One of the last experiments that I'm going to talk about is one of the more infamous ones that we Americans tend to know when it comes to the experimentation of blacks in America, and that is the Tuskegee syphilis study of 1932. This was made by the U.S. Public Health Service in order to basically show the progression of syphilis in black people. It was thought at the time that syphilis affected blacks differently than whites, and so they wanted to prove it in this study somehow. So they would get around 600 sick and poor sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama, and promise them free medical care. Now, slavery in Macon County had ended about 70 years prior, but the black community was very much so still being controlled by the wealthy whites in this area. The median income, it was said, for 82% of the blacks living in this area was about $1 a day, which was way below the poverty line at the time. And many of them were said to not even see this dollar because they were in so much debt with the white people that they worked for. Many of these people hadn't even seen a doctor. Like, this experiment was the first time that they had ever received medical care in their life. This, along with the dirty working conditions and the housing that they still lived in, because the housing never got better for them, you would see the syphilis rate in blacks in Macon County rise to about 36%. But what may shock a lot of you, and probably including the doctors at the time, was that 61% of these syphilis cases were not contracted through sexual activity, it was contracted congenitally. So it wasn't, you see at the time, like, they victim blame very much so. They say, oh, these are over-sexualized species because they don't even think of them as fucking humans. It's disgusting. And they're like, this is why this is happening to you. And it's like, no, it's not. It's because you're forcing them to live in these conditions and you're not giving them any of the proper help that they need. You're literally setting them up for failure. So the Public Health Service would step in and explain to these people that they wanted to study their syphilis as well as cure it in order to help this community that has been so affected by this disease. But what they don't know is that these men are being lied to, and that instead of treating them for the syphilis, these doctors would basically give them placebo pills. They would withhold treatment from them and instead document the effects that these men had up until the point at which they died from the syphilis. And from there, they would then perform an autopsy very gruesomely in order to see the effects that this syphilis had on their bodies. If syphilis is left untreated in the body, it becomes dormant before it enters a secondary stage where you start to see skin growths, you get running sores, what's called gumma, you get bone decay, and heart damage can occur within the body. You can survive these type of symptoms for several decades before the profound neurological damage that happens from this disease becomes too much, and then you see people suffer from blindness, insanity, paralysis, and then finally death. They would select 339 out of the 600 people that they tested to observe and then begin to give them, again, those placebo pills so that they think that they are being aided in their treatment of syphilis. They would also pick 200 uninfected men who were also wooed with medications, and when a dozen of these men ended up developing syphilis over the 40 years that this experiment took place, they would then transfer them into the infected group, which, if you're a scientist, that's like a huge no-no. You don't do that because you need a controlled group, and it just like messes up with the experiment. Like, don't trust me, trust the scientists, because that's what the book said. Mm-hmm. So some of these men wouldn't even see any type of treatment for the full 30 years that this went on, until 1972, at which a successful treatment had already been made. And this treatment even messed up with the study, because around 30 men, 7.5% of the experiment, were able to find this type of treatment on their own and finally get the help that they need. Because the PHS, the Public Health Service, went through extreme lengths to keep this men sick. They would not allow them to go to doctors unless it was a doctor that they said it was okay to go to, because they wouldn't treat them. And they would even tell the government, don't draft these men, because if you're drafted, you may get treatment, and that's going to mess with our experiment. We don't want that. By 1955, nearly 1/3 of the autopsied men had died directly from syphilis, and many of the survivors who were still alive by then were suffering from the deadliest complications, so like the paralysis, the blindness. 40 of the wives at this point had been infected, and at least 19 children were born with the syphilitic birth defects. In 1958, the PHS would award a certificate of appreciation. This would be signed by the Surgeon General and would have a gold seal. And this is what they would give to each infected man, along with $25. Oh. Apparently it was $1 for each year of the study at that point.
Okay, that's enough.
Yeah, so enough. So when word started to spread and people began to find out what was really going on within this experiment, of course, the Public Health Service would deny any acknowledgement of human rights abuse going on, stating that the men, if they were treated now, it could potentially risk their health, which is just doesn't make any sense. A panel that was meant to review the PHS would in turn help aid and abet into their human rights fucking violation by destroying a tape of evidence. So they would destroy a tape that held all the interviews from every victim, the nurses, the doctors that were involved, and for whatever reason, I literally don't know. I don't know why they would do this, but they just decided it would be best if they burned the tape and not have anyone hear it. And now all of these victims are deceased. There's no way for us to get in contact with them, and we're never going to know. The panel's recommendation ended the study in 1972 after the 40 years, and the families finally began to receive medical treatment. The Macon County Attorney Fred Gray filed a $1.8 billion class action civil lawsuit on July 23rd of 1973, which he named as defendants HEW, the PHS, and the CDC, as well as the state of Alabama and Milbank Fund, and a bunch of other PHS officers and a few John Does. All of these people he was suing because for their responsibility in this study. The suit ended in 1974 in a out-of-court settlement for more than $10 million. Though this seems like a lot, it only yielded about $37,500 for each living study participant.
Yeah. Oh.
About $15,000 for their heirs, and the other $1 million went to legal fees for Gray. So he made quite a pretty buck off of this. The living control group members in this experiment received even less than that, and it wasn't even stated how much they got. So, as we know, this is, again, one of the most widely used examples of medical experimentation on Black people in America. But what people fail to realize that this is far from the worst, and it is far from the last experiment that has happened. When the Tuskegee study was being exposed for all of the wrongdoings that was going on, there was actually an experiment in malaria therapy that was going on at the same time, in which researchers were outright killing Black people affected with syphilis in order to test a theory of treatment. So they
Malaria or syphilis?
They had syphilis. I'm not a doctor, so I do not know why we're experimenting malaria therapy with people affected in syphilis.
Okay.
But that, I guess, malaria therapy was maybe thought of as a way to cure syphilis. And she also goes into a lot of information on malaria therapy within Blacks because they have the sickle cell trait. There's so much stuff that I don't cover. She goes into really like good scientific detail. But yeah, for whatever scientific reason, like they're using malaria treatment on Blacks affected with syphilis. Dr. Mark Boyd would infect 470 syphilitic Blacks with a deadly falciparum strain, which as soon as he did this would outright kill some of the patients. It was not a productive form of therapy. It was just straight up deadly. Of course, when these patients began dying, Boyd didn't stop. Instead, he disguised the cause of death and distorted the rate at which he was killing them, much like Thomas Jefferson. And I didn't mention, but Sims, he would hide a lot of his data too.
Yeah, not surprised.
You would think that after such public escapades of like these experiments and these killings going on, that this would stop. But unfortunately, I'm just on part 1. Yeah. I have 2 more parts that I'm going into, and it's downright shocking what we talk about.
Let us not forget, it's only the beginning.
This is only the beginning. We haven't even gotten to today's horrors. So I'm going to end part 1 here. I hope I did not scare y'all that much, but just imagine the people that were fucking going through this, and they're not even properly acknowledged throughout history for their fucking sacrifice that they weren't even able to give consent to. It is horrifying.
I need to go lay down.
I need to chug a bottle of wine and forget that this ever happened.
Yeah. Wow, Kristen. I mean, I knew like unethical experiments happened within the upbringing of Western medicine, or just even in general. And I guess I never realized or put 2 and 2 together that it did happen to slaves and those who had no rights or were seen as less. And so it's just completely disturbing. And just to think the role that slaves and others had in medical experiments, and it's just, we have to give that recognition and respect, because it's not the only area where African American or Blacks or slaves have contributed to the building of society and America as we know it. So
yeah, and how it still affects them to this day.
Historical and generational trauma, along with historical and generational racism. It's a fucking whammy no one wants to experience. Never left. This book was shocking to read, and I leave a lot of stuff out. It took me a few months for a while. I very much had to put this book down and think about life. Now we know why it took you a while. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
so
thank you. That was very enlightening, although disturbing and sickening and heartbreaking. And I can wait to hear what other fucked up shit you talk about, but I also can't.
Yeah, I'm gonna go drink and try to forget about life for a little bit. Yeah. So until next time, guys, cheers to that. Be sure to like, follow, comment, subscribe if you want to hear more, or yeah,
at RARW podcast.
And if there is a certain topic that you're curious to learn about, you can always send us an email, let us know. We're happy to take offers.
Yeah, just talk to us. I don't know. Red rum and red wine podcast at gmail.com.
If you want us to try a wine, well, as long as it's under $20, we're more than happy to try it out.
Yeah.
You forget we're broke bitches, so keep it within reason.
I prefer under 10, but you know.
Give Sarah the 10 out, like 15. 15 is good for me, but I want to salute, but it doesn't feel right. Okay, my child's dying.